Nora Bretfort's fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass with a white-knuckled grip of a woman pushed to her limit. She didn't dare turn around, but she could feel the heat of the masked man's breath against her neck, smelling of cheap brandy and a terrifying sense of entitlement. She had spent the last hour navigating the shadows of the masquerade, trying to maintain the invisible dignity required of a governess, but Baron Vane had finally cornered her in the alcove. "I told you to unhand me, sir," she hissed, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a cold, simmering rage. When a heavy, gloved hand came down firmly on her shoulder, Nora didn't wait for a reply. She didn't think about her lack of a dowry or her precarious position in the house. She simply pivoted and flicked her wrist. The deep, ruby bordeaux left her glass in a perfect arc, splashing across the man's pristine white silk mask and soaking into the intricate lace of his cravat. "Well," a low, resonant voice rippled with a startling amount of calm. "That is certainly one way to decline a conversation." Nora's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the wine drip from a jawline that was far too sharp and aristocratic to belong to the bloated Baron Vane. The man reached up, peeling away the sodden silk mask to reveal eyes the color of flint, hazel, piercing, and currently cataloguing every inch of her mortified face. The ballroom around them fell into a vacuum of silence. Conversations died, fans stopped fluttering, and the heavy weight of 1,000 judging eyes confirmed her catastrophic error. "Oh no," she breathed, the empty glass feeling like a lead weight in her hand. "Oh yes," he replied, his mouth quirking into a ghost of a smile as he pulled a linen handkerchief to dab at his chin. "Though I'm not sure if you're horrified by the waste of a good vintage or the fact that I am not, in fact, the man you were trying to drown." He stepped closer, his presence effectively shielding her from the prying eyes of the crowd. He took the empty glass from her shaking fingers and set it on a passing tray with a casual perfection that suggested he had never once feared a social consequence in his life. I apologize, sir," she managed to stammer. "I didn't mean to impose. That is, I thought you were the Baron." "Understandable," he said, his tone conversational as he tilted his head. "The Baron has the persistence of a bloodhound and roughly the same level of personal hygiene. Still, drenching a man in the middle of a duke's ballroom is hardly in the governess's handbook of etiquette, is it?" "You can't say that," Nora hissed, heat flooding her cheeks. "That's hardly proper." "Proper?" He repeated the word as if it were a foreign language. "No, I suppose staining 1,000 guinea cravat isn't proper. Perhaps I should have let you hit me with the bottle instead. It might have made for a more dramatic story." A laugh tried to escape her throat. She swallowed it, horrified. "You're making this worse." "Am I?" He shifted, his broad shoulders blocking her entirely from the view of the approaching host. "Strange. I thought I was making it better. You're no longer being accosted, and I've had the only interesting encounter of the season, though I suppose we haven't been properly introduced." He paused for effect, his gaze intensifying. "I'm Michael Gibson." The name hit her like a bucket of ice water. Gibson. Not just any Gibson, but the Gibson, heir to the Duke of Ravensworth, the man whose family held the mortgage on the very school where she worked. She had heard her employer speak of him only in tones of absolute terror, describing him as a man far too reclusive and cold for his own good. "And you are," he prompted. "Unemployed, most likely," Nora said flatly. "As soon as your father sees that stain." "Pity," Michael said, his voice dropping an octave, honey-thick and dangerous. "I was hoping to learn the name of the woman who defends her honor with such fermented precision." "Nora Bretfort," she said, the words more curt than intended. "Governess to the Sterling children." Something shifted in his expression, recognition, perhaps, of what that title meant. It meant she was a woman who lived on the edge of respectability, visible only when she was useful and ruined the moment she became inconvenient. "Well, Miss Bretfort," Michael said, "since we are already scandalously acquainted, perhaps you'd like to know what I'm doing tonight. I imagine you think I'm here to find a bride or discuss the corn laws. I imagine you're here to do what all heirs do. Be seen and be bored. Wrong on both counts." He stepped into her space, his voice a low murmur meant only for her. "I'm conducting a social experiment. I'm trying to see how much of my father's reputation I can ruin before he finally admits that I am entirely unsuited for his dukedom. So far, I've told the Countess her perfume smells like a stable, and now, thanks to you, I look like I've lost a fight with a grape. I think we're off to a marvelous start." Nora stared at him, unsure whether to be appalled or entirely impressed. "Hello, lovely. If you're captivated by this tale of a brilliant inventor and her dark duke, please leave a like or subscribe. I'd love to know in the comments, what's the most breathtaking save you've ever read in a story? I read every note."
The crimson liquid continued its slow, rhythmic march down the lapels of Michael Gibson's coat, a stark and damning contrast to the pristine white of his evening wear. Nora Bretfort stood frozen, the crystal stem of a glass feeling like a jagged shard of ice in her hand. Around them, the glittering masquerade had transformed into a gallery of wax figures. The music seemed to thin and die, leaving only the sound of Michael's steady, unfazed breathing and the distant, panicked murmur of the crowd realizing exactly whose blood-red baptism they had just witnessed. "I believe," Michael said, his voice cutting through the sudden vacuum of the room with a terrifying clarity, that the vintage was a 1789. A bit revolutionary for Tuesday, wouldn't you agree? He didn't shout. He didn't even snay. He simply reached up and peeled away the sodden silk of his mask, revealing a face that was a masterclass in aristocratic composure. His hazel eyes weren't burning with rage. They were cool, analytical, and fixed entirely on Nora as if she were the most fascinating specimen he had ever encountered in a laboratory. The collective gasp that followed was physical, a wave of shock that rippled from the velvet curtains to the gilded chandeliers. "The Earl of Ashworth," a voice hissed from the periphery. "She's drowned the Duke's heir." The whispers began to catch like wildfire, malicious, delighted, and utterly destructive. Nora could practically feel her reputation dissolving in the spilled wine. She was no longer Nora Bretfort, the diligent governess with a penchant for Shakespeare. She was a servant who had dared to assault the future of the Ravensworth line. "My lord," Nora managed, her voice cracking beneath the weight of 1,000 judging glares. I thought you were the Baron." He wouldn't take no for an answer, "And you decided that if he wouldn't hear you, perhaps he would feel you," Michael finished for her, dabbing at a stray drop of wine on his cheek with a linen square. He stepped forward, his massive frame looming over her, not to threaten, but to create a barrier between her and the circling vultures of the ton. An efficient, if somewhat damp, solution to a persistent problem. But the social fallout was already in motion. The Duchess of Bellingham was approaching with the predatory grace of a shark, her fan snapping shut like a gunshot. "Michael, my dear boy, what on earth has this person done to you?" She looked at Nora as if she were a smudge of dough on a ballroom floor. "Guards, have this woman removed at once. To think a governess would harbor such violent tendencies." The humiliation was a cold, sharp blade. Nora saw her future, the cottage she had saved for, the independence she had bled for, vanishing into the red stains on the rug. But before the guards could reach her, Michael's hand shot out, his fingers closing firmly, almost possessively, over Nora's trembling wrist. "There will be no removals, Duchess," Michael stated, his tone shifting into the resonant steel of a man born to rule. He looked down at his ruined clothes and then back at the room, a daring, reckless light dancing in his flinty eyes. "Miss Bretfort and I were merely testing the durability of Ravensworth silk. It appears the wine won. Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe I require a fresh cravat and Miss Bretfort requires my protection from your rather uninspired gossip." As he led her through the parting crowd, the silence was replaced by a roar of speculation. Nora followed him, her head spinning. She had defended herself with wine, but as she looked at the broad, wine-stained back of the man leading her away, she realized the real battle hadn't even begun. She had survived the Baron, but she was now the captive of a duke's heir who seemed to find her ruinous blunder the most entertaining thing to happen to him in years. The morning light was far too bright for a woman who had spent the night contemplating the exact cost of a third-class passage to the colonies. Nora sat in the cramped parlor of her modest lodgings, a single cup of lukewarm tea resting on a table that had seen better decades. She was already mentally packing her trunk, the leather-bound books first, the dignity last, when the sound of a carriage rumbled to a halt outside. It wasn't the rattling hackney of an angry employer, but the heavy, rhythmic clip-clop of matched thoroughbreds. The knock that followed wasn't a request, it was an announcement. When Nora opened the door, she didn't find a process server or constable. She found Michael Gibson, the Earl of Ashworth, looking dangerously impeccable in a charcoal morning coat that showed absolutely no evidence of last night's vintage. He stepped across the threshold without waiting for an invitation, his presence instantly shrinking the room until Nora felt she was standing in a dollhouse. "You look as though you've been rehearsing your defense for the gallows, Miss Bretfort," Michael said, his gaze sweeping over her small collection of belongings with that same analytical cool he displayed in the ballroom. "I assure you, I am not here to have you arrested. My father, however, has spent the last 6 hours screaming about the stain on the Gibson honor. He is currently drafting a list of all the ways he intends to see you ruined." Nora's hand tightened on the doorknob. "Then why are you here? To get a front-row seat to my professional execution." "On the contrary," Michael said, making himself at home on her frayed settee. "I'm here to offer you a stay of execution. My father's obsession with his legacy has reached a boiling point. He believes I am a social disaster, a reclusive, cold-blooded disappointment who can't navigate a simple gala without getting drenched in wine. He wants me to marry a woman who has all the personality of a wet slate simply because her pedigree is spotless." He leaned forward, his hazel eyes locking onto hers with a sudden, intense focus. "I need a social advisor. Someone who isn't intimidated by the title, someone who has seen the underbelly of these parties and survived. More importantly, I need a woman who can help me perform the role of a reformed gentleman so convincingly that my father stops breathing down my neck about his wretched legacy." Nora stared at him, her mouth agape. "You want me, the woman who humiliated you in front of the entire town, to teach you how to be a gentleman? That is not an advisor, my lord. That is a death wish." "It is an opportunity," Michael corrected. "I will pay you triple your governess's salary. I will ensure that my father's lawyers never utter your name again. And when the season is over, I will provide the funds for that cottage you've been dreaming of. You help me fix my image by teaching me how to fake the charm I don't possess, and in exchange, you buy your freedom." Nora looked at him, the broad shoulders, the arrogant tilt of his head, the man who held her future like a toy. It was an outrageous, scandalous, and entirely impossible proposal. It was the exact opposite of the safe independence she had worked for. "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly. "Then you can continue packing that trunk," Michael said, standing up and towering over her. "But I suspect a woman who throws wine at an ale is not a woman who prefers a quiet retreat. What do you say, Miss Bretfort? Shall we give my father the shock of his life?" Nora looked at his outstretched hand, realizing that her self-sacrificing isolation was about to be replaced by the most dangerous partnership of her life. She reached out and shook it. The deal was struck. The following Tuesday, the drawing room of Michael's townhouse became a battlefield of etiquette, though the weapons were fans and tea service rather than swords and wine. Nora sat perched on the edge of a mahogany chair, her posture as rigid as the expectations she was about to impose. Michael, conversely, paced the length of the Persian rug like a caged panther, looking far more comfortable at the prospect of a duel than a polite conversation about the weather. "Stop pacing, my lord," Nora commanded, snapping her fan open with a sound like a small pistol shot. "A gentleman does not prowl. He glides. He occupies space with a relaxed confidence that suggests he is exactly where he is meant to be." Michael stopped mid-stride, turning to her with a look of genuine bewilderment. "I am 6 feet tall and built for the saddle, Miss Bretfort. If I glide, I shall look like a cat in a dress shop. My father wants me to be charming, not ethereal. Charm is not a personality trait, it is a performance," Nora countered, standing to face him. She walked toward him, realizing for the first time just how much space he truly occupied. Up close, the flinty gray of his eyes was softened by a flicker of something she hadn't expected, nerves. The powerful A to Ravensworth was actually unsettled. "Let us begin with the bow. It must be deep enough to show respect, but brief enough to show you have other, more important places to be. Try it." Michael stiffened, his shoulders squaring as he bent at the waist. It was a movement of pure, unadulterated tension, as if his spine were made of iron rather than bone. He looked less like a courtier and more like a soldier expecting a blow to the back of the neck. "Again," Nora said, suppressed amusement tugging at the corners of her mouth. "And this time, try not to look as though you are preparing for an execution. Soften your gaze, Michael. You are greeting a debutante, not a French spy." "The debutantes are often more dangerous," he muttered, though he attempted the movement again. This time, he overcompensated, nearly stumbling into a side table. He let out a low growl of frustration, running a hand through his dark, thick hair until it stood at an untidy angle. "This is absurd. I can manage a regiment, I can balance the estate's ledgers to the penny, and I can negotiate with the Prime Minister. Why can I not simply talk to a woman without feeling like a fool?" Nora softened. The iron air mask had slipped, revealing a man who had spent so much of his life in study and service that the basic mechanics of human connection felt like a foreign language. It was her first glimpse of the vulnerability he guarded so fiercely. "Because," Nora said softly, stepping into his personal space to adjust the tilt of his chin, "you are used to commanding people, not connecting with them. You think every word must be a strategic victory. But in a ballroom, the victory is in the silence. It's in the way you listen, not the way you speak." His hazel eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the lesson was forgotten. The air in the room grew heavy, the distance between them suddenly feeling far too small. Michael didn't pull away. Instead, his gaze dropped to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. The social awkwardness was still there, but beneath it burned a raw, unrefined intensity that made Nora's heart skip a beat. "Show me," he whispered, his voice losing its aristocratic edge. "Show me how to listen." Nora realized then that Michael Gibson wasn't just a project to be managed. He was a man who had been lonely in a crowd his entire life, and she was the only one brave enough to tell him why. The evening of the Sterling Charity Gala arrived with a humid, heavy heat that seemed to make the very walls of Michael's dressing room press inward. His valet had been dismissed in a fit of Gibson temper after failing to achieve the effortless knot Michael had been practicing, leaving the Earl standing before floor-to-ceiling pier glass in a state of disheveled frustration. His shirt was open at the throat, and a pile of discarded, mangled silk cravats lay on the floor like fallen white flags. Nora entered without knocking, her own gown of modest sapphire silk rustling against the floorboards. "If you continue to strangle the silk, my lord, it will eventually stop fighting back and simply shred," she said, her voice a calm anchor in the sea of his irritation. Michael turned, his dark hair damp from a recent wash and his chest heaving slightly. "The wretched thing won't sit right. My fingers feel like sausages, and every time I look in this mirror, I see my father's sneer reflected back at me. He'll be there tonight, Nora, watching for the slightest slip." "Then don't look at the mirror," Nora murmured, stepping toward him. "Look at me." She reached out, her fingers brushing against the warm skin of his neck as she took the ends of the fresh silk cravat. The contact was electric. Michael went perfectly still, his breath hitching as she stood mere inches from him, her scent, a mixture of lavender and the old paper of her books, filling the narrow space between them. For the first time, the social experiment felt secondary to the raw, physical reality of the man standing before her. Nora focused on the knot, her hands steady despite the frantic drumming of her heart. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest, the solid strength of his shoulders, and the way his gaze remained fixed on her face with a searing, unblinking intensity. As she tucked the silk into place, her knuckles grazed the underside of his jaw. Michael didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into her touch, his hand rising to cover hers, pinning it gently against his collarbone. "You have a remarkable way of quieting the noise in my head, Nora," he whispered. The use of her given name, stripped of titles and propriety, made the air in the room feel thin. "I am merely doing the job I was hired for," she replied, though her voice lacked its usual sharp conviction. She looked up, her eyes meeting his, and found a vulnerability there that went beyond social awkwardness. It was a hunger to be known, to be seen as something other than a disappointment or pawn. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken possibilities. Michael's thumb traced a slow, deliberate circle over the back of her hand, a gesture so intimate it felt more scandalous than the wine throwing had ever been. For a heartbeat, Nora thought he might lean down, that the distance she had so carefully maintained would vanish entirely. The independence she prized felt suddenly like a lonely island, and the man she had meant to fix was looking at her as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. "The gala starts in 20 minutes, she whispered, her breath ghosting over his lips. "Then let them wait," Michael replied, his voice a low growl of defiance. He didn't let go of her hand, and as they stood trapped in the golden glow of the candlelight, Nora realized that the most dangerous part of their bargain wasn't the Duke's wrath, but the way her own heart was beginning to betray her. The golden light of the Royal Opera House was blinding, a shimmering sea of diamonds and silk that felt more like a battlefield than a sanctuary of art. Nora walked beside Michael, her hand resting lightly on the fine wool of his sleeve, feeling every inch the intruder. She had traded her governess's cotton for a gown of midnight velvet, but the weight of the fabric couldn't disguise the fact that she was a woman whose presence here was a scandal in the making. Michael, however, held his head with a newfound, icy poise, his hazel eyes fixed forward as if the gasps following them were merely the rustle of the wind. "Breathe, Nora," he murmured, his voice a low vibration meant only for her. "You taught me that a gentleman occupies space with confidence. Tonight, you are a lady, and this gallery belongs to you as much as any duchess." But the ton disagreed. As they moved toward the Gibson family box, the whispers rose like the hum of a disturbed hive. "The wine tosser," she heard one woman hiss behind a painted fan. "A common nursery maid in Ashworth's box?" The Duke must be catatonic with rage. The barbs were sharp, intended to draw blood, and for a moment Nora's defensive pride wavered. She felt the urge to pull her hand away, to disappear back into the shadows where she was safe and invisible. Suddenly, a group of young dandies blocked their path, led by a man whose sneer was as sharp as his cravat was tall. "Gibson, we heard you had a taste for rare vintages, but we didn't realize you'd taken to collecting the glassware as well. Is she here to sing, or merely to ensure no one's glass remains full?" Nora felt Michael's arm stiffen beneath her touch. The old, explosive Gibson temper flared for a second, but then she saw him settle, his shoulders relaxing into the very performance she had drilled into him. He didn't snap, he smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made the young man blink in confusion. "She is here at my invitation," Michael said, his voice carrying just enough edge to silence the immediate circle. "And considering the wit she's displayed this evening, I find her company far more intoxicating than any wine. Perhaps if you spent less time cataloguing the guests and more time listening to the music, you might learn something about harmony." He didn't wait for a response, leading Nora past them with a fluid grace that left the group speechless. Inside the velvet-lined box, the air was cooler, but the tension remained. Below them, 100 opera glasses were turned upward, not at the stage, but at the scandalous pair in the Duke's seats. Nora sank into the chair, her heart still racing. "They hate me, Michael. They will never see me as anything but the woman who ruined your coat." Michael leaned in close, his hand lingering on the back of her chair, his thumb grazing the velvet near her shoulder. "Let them look. They hate you because they cannot control you, and they fear me because I no longer care for their approval. Tonight, the only person in this theater I care to impress is sitting right here." As the orchestra began the first swelling notes of the overture, Nora realized the social experiment had shifted. It was no longer about fixing Michael's image. It was about the two of them standing together against a world that thrived on their isolation. The whispers continued in the dark, but for the first time in years, Nora didn't feel like a ghost. She felt seen, and the danger of that feeling was far more terrifying than any insult. The scent of cheap brandy and stale tobacco hit Nora before the voice did, a cold dread pooling in her stomach that was far more visceral than any fear of social gossip. They were strolling through the sculpture gallery during the opera's intermission when Baron Vane emerged from the shadows of a marble Apollo, his face flushed with a mixture of drink and a long-simmering grudge. He was the man she had intended to drown in Bordeaux, the man whose wandering hands had necessitated her desperate defense, and tonight he looked like a hunter who had finally found his cornered prey. "Ah, the little governess," Vane sneered, his eyes raking over Nora's midnight velvet with a look that stripped her bare. He ignored Michael entirely, stepping directly into Nora's personal space. "I see you've traded your aprons for silk, though we all know the heart of a servant remains beneath. Tell me, Does the Earl know you as liberal with your favors as you are with your wine? Or did you have to spill a bottle on him just to get his attention? Nora's hand shook where it rested on Michael's arm, her defensive pride flaring even as her blood ran cold. Before she could find a cutting retort, Michael stepped forward. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't reach for the Baron's throat, though the muscles in his jaw were pulled as tight as a bowstring. He simply moved with that fluid, predatory grace Nora had taught him, positioning himself like a wall of solid granite between her and the Baron's stench. "Baron Vane," Michael said, his voice a low, lethal vibration that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. "I find it curious that a man of your distinguished reputation feels the need to accost a lady in a public gallery. One might almost think you were nursing a bruised ego alongside that bruised reputation." Vane's face went a mottled purple. "A lady? She's a nursery maid who assaulted a peer of the realm. She belongs in Newgate, or perhaps in my employ where I can teach her proper manners." Michael tilted his head, a cold, mocking smile playing on his lips, the very reformed gentleman performance Nora had drilled into him, now weaponized with terrifying precision. "I think you misunderstand the situation, Baron. Miss Bretfort didn't assault a peer. She conducted a necessary sanitation. And as for her employ, she is currently under the protection of the House of Ravensworth. To insult her is to suggest that my judgment, and by extension my father's, is flawed." He leaned in closer, his hazel eyes narrowing to flinty slits. "Now, I am a man of great patience, but I find that my tolerance for boyish behavior is at an all-time low. You can either offer Miss Bretfort a sincere apology for your clumsiness at the masquerade, or I can spend the next hour discussing your outstanding gambling debts with the Duke of Wellington, who is currently standing 10 yards away." The shift in the air was instantaneous. The Baron looked toward the Duke, then back at Michael's unyielding expression. The threat was elegant, bloodless, and absolute. Vane's bravado crumbled into a weak, stuttering cough. He gave a jerky, insincere bow toward Nora, his eyes burning with a loathing he was too cowardly to act upon, before scurrying back into the crowd like a rat. As the silence returned to the gallery, Michael didn't pull away. He turned to Nora, his expression softening into something raw and protective. "Are you all right?" he whispered, his hand covering hers. Nora exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You didn't hit him," she murmured, marveling at the restraint she knew had cost him dearly. "You told me that victory is in the silence, Nora," he replied, his gaze lingering on her with a heat that made the gallery feel far too small. "I'm learning. But if he ever touches you, all the lessons in the world won't save him." The afternoon sun was a low, hunted gold, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Michael's ancestral estate. They had fled the stifling gossip of the city for a few days of strategic retreat, but as Nora sat beneath the sweeping, silver-green branches of an ancient weeping willow, the strategy felt secondary to the peace. The water of the lake lapped softly against the shore, a rhythmic sound that seemed to loosen the tight knots of propriety Nora had worn like armor for years. Michael sat beside her, his jacket discarded and his shirt sleeves rolled up, looking less like an owl and more like the man she was beginning to fear she loved. He was staring at the water, his expression distant and etched with a melancholy that no amount of wealth could mask. "My father thinks this land is a trophy," Michael said, his voice barely louder than the rustle of the leaves. "He looks at these acres and sees power. I look at them and see a gilded cage. I never wanted this, Nora. I never wanted the Duke's seat or the political chess matches in London. When I was younger, I wanted to be an architect. I wanted to build things that were useful, things that stood on their own merit rather than a bloodline." Nora looked at him, surprised by the raw honesty in his tone. "Then why stay? Why play the part?" "Because duty is a relentless master," he replied, turning to look at her. "My brother died when I was 10. He was the one who was supposed to be the Duke. He was the one who loved the crowds and the titles. When he passed, I became a spare part forced into a machine I didn't fit. I've spent my life trying to shrink myself to fit his shadow, and all I've managed to do is become the reclusive disappointment the world sees today." He paused, his hazel eyes searching hers. "And you, Nora, you weren't always a governess. You carry yourself like someone who once had a palace of her own." Nora plucked a blade of grass, her fingers trembling slightly. My father was a merchant who thought he could buy his way into the peerage. He gambled on shipping lines that didn't exist and lost everything, our house, our name, even his own life. I spent my 20th year watching bailiffs tag my mother's jewelry. I learned that day that a woman's only true currency is her independence, because everything else, titles, money, even love, can be stripped away by a man's poor signature. The confession hung in the cool air between them, a bridge of shared scars. Michael reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the grass. This time, the touch wasn't part of a lesson. It was a grounding force, a silent acknowledgement of the ghosts they both carried. I signed those orders to ruin your father's rivals once, Michael whispered, his thumb grazing her knuckles. I saw names on a page, not the daughters behind them. I am the very system that broke your world, Nora. And yet, you are the only person who has ever truly seen me. Nora felt the walls of her self-sacrificing isolation crumbling. She had spent years resenting men like him, men with the power to erase lives with a stroke of a pen. But as she looked at Michael, she saw a man who was just as trapped as she had been, one by poverty, the other by a crown of gold. The romantic tension that had been simmering between them flared, no longer a social experiment, but a dangerous, beautiful truth. The dining room of Ravensworth House was a cathedral of cold marble and sharper tongues, the air thick with the scent of roasted venison and the suffocating perfume of the highborn. At the head of the table sat the Duke, a man who looked as though he had been carved from the very flint that gave his son his eyes. This was the final exam of their charade, a high-stakes dinner where the guests weren't just the elite, but Michael's most vocal political detractors. Nora sat at the center of the table, her midnight velvet a dark anchor amidst the pastels of the debutantes, watching the Duke like a hawk. The trap was sprung during the third course. The Duke leaned back, his wine glass catching the candlelight with a sinister glint. Michael has been quite vocal lately about the reform of the Industrial Shipping Acts, the Duke announced, his voice carrying a practiced, paternal condescension. I'm sure our guests would love to hear his thoughts on the proposed taxation of the northern docks, specifically the clause regarding the Gibson family's private interests. The table went silent. It was a poison question. If Michael supported the tax, he would alienate his peers and his father's allies. If he opposed it, he would look like the selfish, out-of-touch aristocrat his enemies claimed he was. Nora saw Michael's jaw tighten, his fingers ghosting toward his wine glass in a telltale sign of the defensive surge she had taught him to suppress. He was a man of logic and architecture, not of deceptive political maneuvering. The northern docks are a matter of structural integrity, Your Grace, Michael began, but his voice lacked the necessary deflection. He was heading straight for the rocks. Nora didn't hesitate. She didn't have a title, but she had the governess's wit, a lifetime of managing unruly children and desperate situations. She leaned forward, her laughter a soft, silvery bell that broke the tension of the room. "My lord, you are far too modest," she said, her eyes twinkling as she looked toward the Duke. "He spent the entire carriage ride explaining to me that the taxation is a secondary concern to the modernization of the quay walls. He believes that by investing in the safety of the dock workers first, the revenue will naturally stabilize without the need for aggressive levies." She turned her gaze to the most influential detractor at the table, a man obsessed with maritime safety. "I found his focus on the human cost of the shipping lanes quite remarkable, didn't you, Lord Ashford? He spoke of it with the heart of a builder rather than a tax collector." Michael caught the lifeline immediately. The tension left his frame, replaced by the calm, commanding presence they had practiced under the willow. "Indeed," Michael followed up, his voice steady and resonant. "Taxation is a blunt instrument. I would rather see a surgical approach that rewards efficiency and protects the men who actually move the goods." The Duke's eyes narrowed, his trap rendered useless by a woman he had intended to ignore. Lord Ashford nodded in genuine approval, and the conversation shifted toward infrastructure, leaving Michael's political reputation not just intact, but enhanced. As the dinner continued, Michael reached beneath the table. His hand found Nora's, his fingers squeezing hers in a silent, fervent thank you. Nora didn't pull away. She had saved him not with wine, but with the very sharp tongue she had once used to protect herself. In the Duke's cold hall, she realized that they were no longer a teacher and a student, they were a team, and the stain on the Gibson honor was the only thing keeping the light alive. Hey lovely fanatic, please hit the subscribe button and give us a like. It helps bring most tales of love, longing, and history. Thank you. The study of Ravensworth House was a place of dark mahogany and the cold, lingering scent of old tobacco, a room designed to make anyone who entered feel small. When Nora was summoned there the morning after the dinner party, she found the Duke standing by the window, his back to her. He did not offer her a seat. Instead, he placed a small, velvet-lined box and a folded parchment on the desk between them. "I am a man who appreciates efficiency, Miss Bretfort," the Duke began, his voice like the grinding of stones. "You have performed a remarkable service for my son. You have polished his edges and shielded him from his own incompetence. But the performance is over. Michael is now in a position to secure a match that actually benefits this family, a match with the daughter of a marquis, not a woman who throws wine and manages nurseries." Nora felt a familiar, icy prickle of defensive pride. "I am not a performer, Your Grace. I am his advisor. We had an agreement. And I am altering it," the Duke countered, finally turning to face her. He tapped the parchment. "This is a bank draft for £5,000. It is more than you would earn in 3 lifetimes as a governess. There's also a deed to a small, private estate in the Loire Valley. You will leave for France tonight. You will disappear, and in return, you will have the independence you have spent your life mourning." Nora looked at the paper. It was the price of her heart, laid out in black ink. £5,000 was the cottage she had dreamed of. It was the end of her self-sacrificing isolation and the beginning of a life where she answered to no one. It was everything she had told herself she wanted since the day the bailiffs took her mother's rings. "He will think I abandoned him for a price," Nora whispered, her chest tightening with a physical ache she hadn't anticipated. "He will think what I tell him to think," the Duke snapped. "And you will be a wealthy woman with a clean slate. Is that not what your kind always wants? Security." Nora reached out, her fingers hovering over the bank draft. For a heartbeat, she saw the quiet French countryside, the garden she could tend, and the peace of never being looked down upon again. But then she remembered Michael under the willow, the way he had confessed his desire to be a builder, and the heat of his hand as he defended her from the Baron. She remembered the man who was lonely in a crown of gold, the man who had looked at her not as a servant or scandal, but as his equal. Security was a cold mistress. It didn't listen, it didn't laugh, it didn't hold your hand under a dinner table when the world was trying to break you. "You are wrong about one thing, Your Grace," Nora said, pulling her hand back and meeting the Duke's gaze with a fierce, unyielding clarity. "I didn't come here to be a lady, or to buy my way back into your world. I came here to help Michael see that he is worth more than your legacy. And I have realized that his heart is the only currency I am no longer willing to trade." She turned toward the door, leaving the fortune on the desk. "Keep your money. I would rather be a penniless governess with a soul than a wealthy ghost in a French villa. And I suspect Michael will be quite interested to hear what his father thinks of his efficiency." As she walked out of the study, the terror of what she had just done was eclipsed by a sudden, soaring sense of freedom. She had chosen vulnerability over security, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't running from her heart. She was finally following it. The Ravensworth Summer Gala was a spectacle of calculated cruelty, a sea of white silk and cruel intentions designed to act as Michael's final cage. Nora stood at the edge of the ballroom, her dark velvet gown feeling like a funeral shroud as she watched the Duke take the small, raised dais at the end of the hall. The air was thick with the scent of forced lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of an impending execution. Michael stood at the foot of the stage, his face a pale, unreadable mask, his eyes searching the crowd until they locked onto Nora's with a look of silent, desperate apology. "My friends," the Duke's voice boomed, cutting through the quartet's melody like a blade. "In the interest of the Gibson legacy and the stability of the northern interests, I am pleased to announce a union that will solidify our house for generations to come. My son, the Earl of Ashworth, is to be betrothed to Lady Catherine Beaumont." The applause was instantaneous, a deafening roar of approval from a crowd that thrived on the crushing of unconventional spirits. Lady Catherine, a woman of impeccable breeding and the warmth of a marble statue, stepped forward to take her place at Michael's side. The suitable match was perfect in the eyes of the ton, a strategic alliance that erased the stain of Nora's influence and returned Michael to the role he was born to play. Nora felt the world tilt. Despite her defiance in the Duke's study, seeing the public finalized reality of his power was a blow that left her breathless. She saw Michael start to move toward the dais, his jaw set in that hard, dangerous line she knew so well, but she couldn't stay to watch the surrender. She turned, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm against the parquet floor as she fled toward the terrace. The night air was cold, biting at her skin, but it was the hollow ache in her chest that truly numbed her. She had been a fool to think that a governess's wit could outmatch a duke's decree. She had traded her independence for a dream of equality, and now she was left with neither. As she reached the stone balustrade, she saw her small trunk already waiting by the service gate, a silent confirmation that the duke's reach extended even to her private lodgings. He hadn't just bought her exit, he had choreographed her heartbreak. She pulled her shawl tight, her eyes blurred with tears she refused to let fall. She had spent a lifetime learning how to be invisible, how to survive the wreckage of a man's poor choices, and she knew the steps of this dance by heart. She would disappear. She would find another nursery, another house of shadows, and she would pretend that she had never known the heat of Michael's hand or the weight of his hazel gaze. "Goodbye, Michael," she whispered to the wind, the sound of the applause from inside the hall feeling like the slamming of a final door. She took one last look at the silhouette of the man she had tried to save, then turned toward the darkness of the carriage path, ready to return to the isolation she had once called safety. The gravel of the carriage path crunched beneath Nora's boots, a sound that felt like the final gavel strike on her life in London. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. But then a voice, not the Duke's booming authority, but a roar of raw, unadulterated defiance, shattered the polite veneer of the gala. It was the sound of a man finally breaking the machine he had been forced to sieve. Nora stopped, her breath catching in the frigid night air. Inside the hall, the silence was so sudden it was almost deafening. "No," Michael's voice rang out, projected with the commanding clarity of a man who no longer feared the fall. "I will not accept this betrothal, and I will not allow this family to be built on the bones of another lie." Nora turned, her heart clawing at her ribs as she raced back toward the terrace doors. She watched through the glass as Michael stepped away from the frozen Lady Catherine and the livid Duke. He didn't look like a reclusive heir anymore. He looked like the architect he had always wanted to be, ready to tear down the old to build something real. "You forget yourself, Michael," the Duke hissed, his face a muffled, terrifying mask of purple rage. "You are the Earl of Ashworth. You will do as you are told, or you will have nothing." "Then I have nothing," Michael replied, his voice dropping into a lethal, quiet calm that carried to every corner of the room. He reached up, his fingers steady as he unpinned the Gibson family crest from his lapel, the heavy gold eagle that represented centuries of cold, calculated power. He didn't set it down, he let it fall. The metallic clink as it hit the marble floor sounded like a cannon blast. "Keep the title, father. Keep the ledgers and the shipping lanes and the bloodless alliances. I would rather be a man of no name than a duke with no soul." He turned away from the dais, his eyes scanning the crowd with a fierce, searching light until they found Nora standing in the doorway, her midnight velvet silhouetted against the dark night. The tongue parted for him as if he were a storm front, their whispers dying in their throats. "I was told once that a woman's only currency is her independence," Michael said, loud enough for the Duke and every vulture in the room to hear, as he reached the threshold where Nora stood. He stopped inches from her, his hazel eyes burning with a clarity that made her knees weak. "I have spent my life in a gilded cage, Nora, thinking that security was a fair trade for my heart. But you taught me that the only thing worth building is a life where you can look the world in the eye and speak the truth." He reached out, his hand, no longer the hand of a student or pawn, but that of a man who had claimed his own destiny, and took hers. "I am no longer the heir to Ravensworth. I am a man with a shattered reputation and a talent for architecture that has sat dormant for too long. I have no title to offer you, only a future that we build with our own hands." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, oblivious to the scandalized gasps of the elite behind them. "Will you have me, Nora? Not as an earl, but as the man who is finally brave enough to love you." Nora looked into his eyes and saw the end of her self-sacrificing isolation. She saw a life that was terrifying, impractical, and utterly, beautifully theirs. She squeezed his hand, her smile a radiant defiance of its own. "I think," she whispered, "that we have a cottage to build." The aftermath of Michael's public renunciation was not the clean, cinematic silence of a finished play, but a messy, roaring transition. The Duke's rage had been a cold, thundering thing, resulting in a swift legal disinheritance and the immediate locking of Ravensworth's heavy iron gates behind them. But as Nora and Michael stood on the steps of a modest, sun-drenched cottage in the rolling hills of the Cotswolds 6 months later, the weight of that ancestral stone felt like a lifetime ago. The iron heir was gone, replaced by a man whose hands were often stained with graphite and sawdust rather than ink and wine, a man who spent his mornings sketching the foundations of the local parish school and his evenings looking at Nora as if she were his North Star. Their new life was built on the very things Nora had once feared: vulnerability, shared labor, and a scandalous lack of propriety. There were no footmen to announce their arrivals and no duchesses to whisper behind fans. Instead, there was the smell of damp earth after a rain, the scratch of Michael's pencil against parchment, and the quiet, steady rhythm of a home that belonged to no one but themselves. Nora had traded her midnight velvet for practical cotton, and her defensive pride had softened into a resilient, quiet joy. She was no longer a governess hiding in the shadows. She was a woman whose name, Mrs. Michael Gibson, carried a weight of her own choosing. On a warm evening, as the first stars began to pierce the twilight, Michael emerged onto their small porch carrying 2 glasses and a dark, dust-covered bottle. He looked at her, his hazel eyes crinkling with a warmth that still made her heart skip. He didn't say anything at first, simply pouring the deep, ruby liquid with a hand that was steady and sure. "I believe we are finally safe from the Baron and the Duke," Michael said, handing her a glass. The wine caught the dying light, casting a shimmering red glow across his fingers. "And I believe I owe you a debt that £5,000 could never have covered." Nora took the glass, her fingers brushing his. The contact no longer felt like a spark in a dark room. It felt like the hearth-fire of a permanent home. "You owe me nothing, Michael. You gave me the one thing I didn't think existed for a woman like me." "And what is that?" he asked, his voice a low, tender murmur. "A choice," she replied. Michael raised his glass, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that promised a lifetime of such moments. The wine was no longer a weapon of desperation or stain of shame. It was a celebration of the messy beginning that had led them to this perfect, quiet end. To the governess who threw wine at an ale, Michael toasted, his smile radiant and free. And to the architect who was finally brave enough to catch it. They drank together, the vintage smooth and sweet on their tongues. As the night air settled around them, Nora realized that they had finally stopped running. They weren't ghosts, and they weren't scandals. They were simply Nora and Michael, and for the first time in either of their lives, that was more than enough. The end.